Good morning. Welcome, those of you just joining us, to the 14th Annual Cosumnes River College and Sacramento State Center for Practical and Professional Ethics Fall Ethics Symposium. Our chair for this session will be Anastasia Dobson-Bell of the Cosumnes River College Honors Program.
Thank you, Dr. Schubert. Again, my name is Anastasia Dobson-Bell, and I will be serving as your session chair this morning. Here's what you may expect for our proceedings going forward. The main speaker will talk for about 40 minutes. Then our two panelists will offer very brief remarks. After that, the main speaker will have a chance to respond to our panelists. Finally, we will transition to the open question and answer period when you, as members of the audience, can pose your questions. Our first panelist is Dr. Jessica Flanagan, Associate Professor of Leadership Studies and Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law from Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. And our second panelist is fellow Cosumnes River College Honors Scholar, Nadia Noah Connolly. That said, it is my pleasure to introduce our main speaker, Professor Michael Austin, Professor of Philosophy and Religion and Department Chair of Eastern Kentucky University. He has published 11 books, including Humility and Human Flourishing, Oxford University Press, 2017, and numerous journal articles related to ethics, philosophy of religion, philosophy of family, and philosophy of sport. With that said, please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Austin.
All right, thank you. It's been a great day and morning already. I've learned a ton from the stuff I've attended, things I didn't know much about, not enough about, so it's good. We're going to talk about this question: should parents instill their values in their children? And like a good philosophy professor, I'm just going to give a qualified yes. All right, can't just say yes or no. Yes, but. So it's a question that we ask a lot. And of course, by now, probably a lot of you have heard about Kanye West's recent conversion to Christianity. Perhaps more than you'd like, perhaps not. You might not know he's been taking this thing called a Sunday service around the country. It involves like music, prayer, and things like that. He's been to Atlanta, Detroit, Southern California. His 6-year-old daughter, North, has been on stage singing with him at these Sunday services, right? And it was a few weeks ago on Jimmy Kimmel. He said this: "I love the fact that my daughter wants to go to church. She has such a positive thought association with going to church because it's outside the traditional 4 walls and pews." Now, of course, that's a more famous and obviously unique example of something that parents do all the time, right? Across the world, they take their kids to religious services, they raise them within a religious framework, try to instill religious values. And of course, it's not just religious beliefs and values that parents are concerned about with their kids. Their moral values, political values. One of my good friends, we were talking about this in a class that we team taught. He wasn't really concerned. He's not a religious guy, didn't care about that. But he wanted to instill his political values, and he wanted to make sure his kids were Pittsburgh Steelers fans. All right, so that was his athletic values, I guess. Could be worse. Could have been a Patriots fan. But anyway, all right. Sorry, I can't help myself. But we regularly do that, right? And parents regularly try to instill at least moral values in their kids. And so for most people, the question of whether or not parents should instill values in their kids, well, of course, right? It's an obvious answer. That's what one of the primary jobs of parenthood is. And isn't it also part of what makes it meaningful, I think, for many people? Brings meaning to their lives to be able to do that. But when we think about this question and a range of related issues, it gets a little more complicated. And so I'm going to argue for 3 things today. First, now this might seem obvious, but these are important. It's unavoidable for parents to influence the values of their children, right? Meaning, parents can't help but do that in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to also argue that parents have the right and the obligation to seek to influence the values of their children. And then lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about a particular form of education that can help them do so in a morally appropriate way. Now, I'll primarily focus in the talk on religious upbringing, and mainly because I think that is the most difficult case in some ways. But what we'll talk about, or what we'll discuss today, applies to moral values, political ones as well. And so, I want to start by making a couple disclaimers. One, I'm going to offer what I think is a pretty demanding ethic for parents. And so let's just admit that I'm a parent, you might be a parent, we had parents, all of our parents failed, right? In the sense that none of us were perfect, right? So let's get that out of the way. And I'm also assuming what philosophers call the ought implies can principle, that if I really have an obligation to do something, it has to be within my power to do it, all right? I have to be able to. So I can't single-handedly stop global climate change right now. It'd be cool if I could, but I can't. Now, I can do certain things to contribute, right, to lessening the problem. So that's one thing. Two is I'm really focused tightly in this talk on the parent-child relationship, right? And in isolation, in reality, children aren't raised in isolation, right? So I just want to emphasize that I think issues like social support, right, whether it's informal, informal, all that stuff matters. But with those things said, I'm going to try to paint a picture of, in many ways, an ideal, I suppose, okay? So let's start talking about some of these things. I wanted to start with a little bit about the basis of parental rights, at least in my view, and I think it'll be helpful to briefly describe that, what I think grounds parental rights, and then talk about the implications of that for the question we're looking at about instilling values. So as human beings, I think that we have certain fundamental interests, and in my view, those things generate rights that correlate to them, right? And so at a basic level, a fundamental interest is just something that's crucial to our well-being as human beings, right? Food, shelter, medical care, basic medical care. But there are other things like psychological well-being, participating or being in intimate personal relationships, and just the freedom to pursue things that bring meaning and satisfaction to our lives. That's part of what it is to be fulfilled. And I think that given that the parent-child relationship is a way that many of these interests can be satisfied, for both parents and children, it follows that certain rights are generated in that context. And so some of these are obvious, right? Children have the right to receive basic care and certain forms of care from their parents. Parents have the right to make certain choices as parents, grounded in these interests, I would argue. So just not really arguing for this view, I'm just kind of saying what I think, and it's going on in the background of what I'm going to argue today. Practically speaking then, right, it suggests some criteria for considering what the strength or extent of parental rights are in any particular case. In particular for today, we'll look at moral upbringing, religious upbringing, those kind of things. And so we can think about a test, right? The psychological welfare of both parent and child, that'll be important. Test of parental rights and obligations. The intimacy of the parent-child relationship, right? We've got a certain ethical dilemma or maybe just ethical question about parenthood. What impact would it have on the relationship one way or the other in general? And then the freedom of both parent and child to pursue things that bring meaning and satisfaction. A little bit more background then, I want to try to conceive of parenthood as a stewardship. And when we think about stewardship, it's not a word we use as much anymore. But a steward is just a caretaker of something that they don't own, right? So if my next door neighbor goes out of town and he asks me to take care of his dogs, well, on his behalf for that weekend or week, I'm a steward of the dogs, right? I make sure they've got stuff dogs need: food, water, shelter, probably attention, right? They're not cats, so they actually need something. But that's being a caretaker on his behalf of the animals, of the dogs. I think we should see ourselves as stewards of just the natural environment, right, for our generation and future ones. And so I want to say there are many ways in which parents are stewards of their children, right? You can think of parents being stewards of their children during the childhood of their children, if that makes sense. So here's what I mean. Parents who take it seriously, they put the welfare and the flourishing of their kids sort of a central aim of their lives, right? Good parents do that. And during childhood, they do what they can to meet those needs, right? To help to care for their kids. They make choices that take the current interests of their children into account. But they're also parents are stewards of the adults that their children will become, right? Now, I'm not Fortunately, right, parents can make a lot of mistakes and do a lot of things wrong, and kids can still turn out fine. So I'm not trying to lock into that kind of determinism or anything like that. But what I do want to say is parents have an influence on that. And at some point, right, parents turn over control of the child's life to the child. Now, of course, it's not like you turn 18 or 21 and here you go, although in some cases, right, that's true. That's how people do it. But ideally, it's more gradual, right? You cede more and more control to the child over the years. And then maybe there is that formal, see you later. But anyway, it's got to be sensitive to the age and maturity of the child. Now, another way that parents are stewards of their kids, I think, is just on behalf of society, right? And society, generally speaking, entrusts the care of children to parents. And I mean that in a very loose sense. I'm not saying we need permission of society to be children, but right, when we fall short or do something that merits forfeiture of parental rights, right, then the state or others can step in and we forfeit those rights. So society has a clear interest in good parenting, insofar as we turn our kids loose on the world, all right, on society at some point, hopefully with more good than bad of an impact out there. All right, so that's the background. Let's consider whether or not parents have the right or the obligation to instill values in their kids. I want to talk a little bit about this because some people are skeptical about the claim that parents have the right to instill their values. They argue that parents should be neutral about that. And we'll talk about a particular case here with religious values. So contemporary philosopher William B. Irvine wrote a book several years ago called Doing Right by Children. And he argues for parental neutrality, all right, about religion. Not about morality or politics, but he does about religion. Right? He thinks parents shouldn't raise their kids within a particular religious framework. So why does he say that? Well, you've got the 3 points here. He thinks that, first, that parents are being hypocritical when they insist their kids adopt their religious faith. He thinks parents should be neutral about religion because they can teach moral values based in reason and not religion. And then lastly, he says parents should be neutral because religious faith is like clothing. The fit is different for different people. Of course, the natural question we want to ask is, well, not just philosophers, but just curious individuals, why? Is he right about these things? So let me explain a little bit what his reasoning is for each of these, and then I'll give my 2 cents about what I think. And we can discuss this and other stuff, obviously, in the Q&A. So parents are being hypocritical when they insist their children adopt their faith. Now this, according to Irvine, is because, so let's say I'm a parent. This is his example. Let's say, this is not the case, but let's say my wife and I are Lutherans, and we want to insist that our kids practice the Lutheran faith. Well, for Irvine, that's hypocritical because at some point in the past, our parents, ancestors, probably rejected the Roman Catholicism of their parents, right? If maybe we traced it all the way back to the Reformation, but at some point, the ancestors of the parents departed from the faith of their parents. And so for him, that's hypocritical for us, the current parents, to insist our kids follow our faith. And so the question is it actually hypocritical? Well, not necessarily, right? I mean, maybe, and I'm not advocating for this, I'm just saying maybe this is a thought process. Maybe the ancestors in question converted to Lutheranism because they thought it was true. Or maybe they just thought that was true. And if the current Lutheran parents in Irvine's thought experiment also think it's true, then it's not clear there's hypocrisy, right? If the devotion is more to what they take religious truth to be, that's consistent. Now, I think he's right that parents should not insist their children, like in a strong, well, yeah, they shouldn't insist that their kids share their faith. And we'll talk about that later, why forcing religious belief, or at least trying to do so, is wrong. Okay, second reason he gives is that parents should be neutral about religion because they can teach moral values grounded in reason and not religion. And Irvine thinks it's better to do that, to teach it. He's not saying, fortunately, they don't need to take a moral philosophy class, but basic moral principles that you can give reasons for why they're good to be, why is it good to be compassionate, caring, humble, courageous, those kind of things, rather than depending on some divine revelation or alleged divine revelation. But the assumption here, obviously, is that religion and reason are opposed to each other, right? And so given that fact, Irvine thinks teaching morals using religion rather than reason is problematic. But of course, one response to that is that faith and reason aren't necessarily opposed to each other. Now, of course, there are numerous irrational, right, religious believers. There are many people actually who are scholars of this stuff who think that faith and reason are opposed to each other, or at least they're somehow distinct, right? They're separate. But of course, many people from different religious traditions think that faith and reason are somehow positively related to each other, right? They think that faith could be based in reason in many ways. And so for them, they can teach morality from within a religious framework that's also in some sense based in reason, all right, on rational thought, critical reflection, those kind of things. So the argument from neutrality for religion here, or the argument for neutrality for religion here, works in some cases, but not in others. All right, last one, he thinks parents should be neutral because religious faith is like clothing, right? The fit, and these are his words, the fit is different for different people. So for Irvine, it's completely valid for parents to introduce their faith to their children because their kids might think it's beneficial, right? They might find it beneficial. But parents shouldn't do more than that, right? Because an alternative faith might be better suited for the children. So given this, Irvine argues a hands-off approach is best. Now, I guess my critique of that would be, in some ways, it's a shallow view of the nature of religious faith, right? So I agree with him to an extent, but the idea that the choice between Hinduism and Buddhism, for example, is like a choice between a green shirt and a red shirt, right? That just seems wrong, right? I mean, religion is not merely a matter of personal fit. Treating that way is arguably to treat it too lightly. Many other issues are important, right? Is there any evidence for or against the truth of the religion in question? Is it conducive to human flourishing or not? What are its personal and social implications, right? So these aren't optional questions, but they're central ones, right? So we shouldn't approach the religious question, as my reply here is, as consumers, right? Because it's not that kind of thing. Religion at its best challenges us, right? It should challenge our thoughts about ethics, about how to live, whatever religious faith we opt for, or none at all. But in this case, we're looking at religion. And so it's not just merely a matter of fit, okay? But again, he's right. Really his concern underlying many of this stuff is about parents who try to indoctrinate their children, and I think he's right about that. So let's talk about what rights parents might have, right? Do parents have the right to instill values? Right? And my answer is, well, no, taken a certain way. I don't think parents have the right to instill their values if we take that strongly, but parents do have the right to seek to influence the values of their children. And so I want to draw an important distinction between those two things. I'm taking the phrase instilling values in a strong way, right? I think instilling to me, and this is just how I'm stipulating it, like, indoctrinating, I guess, or basically it's trying to get our children to have the same values as us without respecting their current and future autonomy, right? So I think autonomy is really important, even at a young age, right? Some people think of autonomy as all or nothing, but it's a developing thing. And so my view here is that if we're trying to instill values in a strong sense, the problem there is we're ignoring the autonomy of the child, right? And to be autonomous just means to be self-governing. It means that I'm directing my life, making my choices according to my beliefs, my preferences, my desires. I'm not suggesting we give 2-year-olds complete autonomy over their lives, right? That's not good. And I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm fully autonomous now, but right, it's something that we develop over a lifetime. But I think it's important that we respect both the developing autonomy of the child, whether it's at 2, 12, 22, and the adult that the child will become. Okay, and so I think parents can seek to influence values of their children while doing that. All right, and that's an important condition. Now, I don't think respect for autonomy exhausts the rights and responsibilities of parents and the values they seek to impart. And as we'll see, trying to influence the values of one's child actually can foster the autonomy of that child. And so I think parents need to keep these things in mind as we seek to influence values. One way to do that, and we'll talk about this more, is to actually allow your kids to come across or be familiar with views of the world, views of religion, views of the good life, political views that are different from the parents, right? So I guess it's an argument in some ways against insular parenting, where you're never letting children come across ideas that are different than you and your spouse or partner have. That's important, because if as a parent I think my views about any of these things are reasonable or good or true, then I should be willing to subject those things to some critical examination. I should be willing to allow my children to raise questions about it as they're able to do so and interact about those things. Okay? Now, this is consistent, the idea that parents can seek to influence values. It's consistent with what I think of the basis of parental rights is, or are. Is, right? Because if it's against my child's interest, if I'm going to act in ways that undermine their present and future autonomy, right, their ability to make their own choices in life. But it's also, seeking to influence values can foster the welfare of the child. It can deepen the connections, right, the closeness in the parent-child relationship, to have those kind of conversations and just to share a way of life with each other. So there are a lot of fundamental interests that can be satisfied. Now, on this issue of autonomy, I mean, these days philosophers and many people love autonomy, and sometimes I get skeptical of how much weight is put on it, but I actually think in this realm of life it's really important. So here's a quote. This is from a book back in the early 80s by Jeffrey Bluestein. He's a philosopher, and he's talking about this issue. He says, autonomy does not magically develop out of nothing. Children need to learn to be autonomous, and this can only happen if they are not autonomous to begin with. Some principles, including autonomy itself, must be implanted in children if they are to grow in the proper direction. Moreover, children must already possess a tentative character, a tentative motivational structure, if they're able to autonomously choose a different character and different beliefs, desires, and traits. Autonomy, the ability to critically reflect on oneself and the freedom to shape one's life in accordance with changing desires and aspirations, cannot exist in a vacuum. It presupposes some relatively settled beliefs, desires, etc. In short, it presupposes a self to reason from and with. Now, there's a lot there, and it feels like one long sentence. Maybe there's two or three. Philosophers are, we do that, unfortunately, these days. There's a lot there. One key lesson, though, is that I think some parents, and I know friends of mine kind of take this approach over the years, they seek to be hands-off with their kids about maybe religion, maybe politics or morality, those kind of things, in order to respect the child's individual autonomy and to allow the child to develop and exercise, to find find their own way, is the idea. But what Bluestein's pointing out here is there's a mistake there, right? That you, as a child, they have to have starting points. They've got to have a view of the world, a view of the good life, a view of what a certain character to begin with. And then when I have that, as I get older and mature, I can change it, alter it, reject it, come around back to it. Right? All those things happen. Okay. More simply put, I'm just trying to make the point that it's impossible to be value neutral as a parent. Right. Often the goal of that kind of parenting is autonomy, but as we've just said, autonomy, well, it's developed within a framework of a good life, and really strictly speaking, autonomy is a value, and so you can't be completely value neutral, right? There's no such thing as entirely value neutral parenting. Given that we can't avoid as parents influencing the values of our children, given that I think any parenting choice is value laden, maybe we do better to actually be reflective and intentional about it, right? Now look, we can think of examples like, sort of the stereotypical, like maybe a highly religious family. So doesn't matter, conservative, like maybe less conservative, moderate, progressive Christian parents, right? They might, their values, they're going to try to influence the values of their kids by the things they do, taking them to church once a week, or in my part of the country where we live now, more than that, many do, which is hard when you're, a soccer coach and kids aren't there, but, that's okay, because soccer's not the most important thing for some people. All right. But yeah, they might engage in a lot of religious practices, right? Take their kids to church, Sunday school, family prayer, Bible study, serving other people in their church or their community. And so I think it's easy to see how, either intentionally or not, parents with, whether it doesn't matter what religion, right, but with a certain view of the good life, about the nature of the spiritual realm, if they have those kind of views, of course they're going to influence values. But of course, atheist, agnostic, or secular parents do that as well. They likely won't be part of a religious community, although they might be for some reasons. But there are still going to be values they're seeking to instill, right? Not necessarily positive religious ones, but moral, political ones, obviously. But even an agnosticism or a sort of hands-off approach to religion that communicates certain values and beliefs to the child about religion, right? If I'm a parent, I don't include religious practices in my life or in my child's life. That communicates something to my child about religious truth or the value of those kind of things. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's just reality, right? And so that no matter where we fall on the spectrum of all these big questions in life, right, we're going to have an influence on our children's values in some sense, okay? So let's talk about, I think parents have the right to seek to influence values because it's good for children in the short and long term. It's good for the parent-child relationship. And in some sense, it's, I think, actually can be good for society as children grow and become a part of their community. Okay? But what about obligations? I think parents are actually obligated to seek to influence the values of their kids. Right? So not just, this hands-off approach taken to an extreme, I think, is a mistake. For one reason, it has to do with the autonomy of the child, and we've talked about that a lot already. Right? We have an obligation, if we're parents, to help our children become autonomous, self-governing, direct their lives the way that they see best. Regardless of the details of any view of the good life, I think autonomy is arguably a fundamental component of human flourishing and of a good life. We value it. So the key point here, I think, is that in order to develop and respect the autonomy of children, parents need to parent their kids within a framework where those values are present, and so they should seek to influence the values of their kids. All right? One thing that makes autonomy important is, of course, we know parents who really strongly want to influence their kids religiously, morally, politically, or to be a Steelers fan, right, whatever it is. But I think it must be, we need to emphasize the fact that a child hasn't truly adopted, right, that view of the good life or those values unless they've freely and autonomously done so, right? And so there's something fundamentally misguided about trying to force someone to believe something, right? Beliefs just aren't that kind of thing, right? I can act like I believe something. I can do what my parents want me to do, right? Go to church every week or vote a certain way or whatever it is. But those things, like if it's religion, it's not authentically the child's faith until the child actually, in some sense, autonomously makes it their own. And the same thing applies to other values. So that's one reason autonomy is important. Along these lines, Gilbert Meilander, in a book called The Limits of Love, so I've got a small part of the quote up there, but I'm going to read the context of it because it's important. And so this is what Meilander says about parenting and the autonomy of children. And so he says this, from Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, from Kierkegaard, I think, I learned about the selflessness of true love. We love another best, he says, when it would be true to say, he stands alone by my help. So that's the part that's on the slide. That dash there is important, and we'll see why. Commenting on the significance of the dash in that sentence, Kierkegaard adds, in this little sentence, the infinity of thought is contained in the most profound way, the greatest contradiction overcome. He stands alone, this is the highest. He stands alone, nothing else do you see. You see no aid or assistance, no awkward bungler's hand holding on to him any more than it occurs to the person himself that someone has helped him. No, he stands alone by another's help. But this help is hidden. It's hidden by a dash. All right, so the point of this, in Kierkegaard's roundabout way, is that in the long run, that's what parents do. That's why it can be painful, right? All of our kids are gone now. We're empty nesters. It's actually nice and quiet, but sometimes boring. But you don't want your kids needing you at 22 or 32 or 42 the same way they did at 2 or 12 or 18, right? So there's that. It's an expression of love to help a child be able to stand alone in this sense. The other reason I think that you could argue that parents have an obligation to instill values in their kids or to seek to influence the values of their kids has to do with the integrity of the parent. I think this is something that gets missed sometimes, right? So let's say I hold a particular moral view about the nature of the good life and what our obligations are to other people in our community and just to other human beings or to animals or whatever it is, right? And those, I think that some basic moral principles are true and crucial for a good life and being contributing to the common good, things like that. It seems like I think those things are true and crucial. And so it seems like it would be to not share those things with my child, to not talk about them, explain why I think they're important, even encourage the child to adopt those values, seems like a lack of integrity, right? It's like, I think these things are really important, but do whatever you want. Now, in a certain sense, at the end of the day, I'm arguing for that. But I'm arguing that a lot should go on between those two things, right? In terms of parental sharing and discussion about the good life. Okay, but what about religious values, right? So can parents be obligated to raise their kids within a particular religious framework? And again, I think the answer is yes, and that kind of obligation can exist, right? First, again, it's impossible not to influence the religious beliefs or the lack of religious belief of a child, right? We've talked about that. But again, just like with morality, I mean, at least some people think about religion, not everybody thinks about it this way, but they think their religious faith is true in some sense, or contributes to personal and social flourishing, those kind of things, part of a good life. So a parent who has that kind of faith, or parents who have that, it seems like integrity, again, might require that they at least share those beliefs with their children, share the practices. But of course, they shouldn't do it in ways that undermine autonomy, nor should they withdraw love and acceptance from a child who chooses a different faith or no faith at all. Okay. All right, so we're going to turn the corner now and look at maybe a way to go about this. And unsurprisingly, since I'm a philosopher, I think one way that we should seek to influence our children's values is through a philosophical education. But let me just say, I don't mean they have to take my class, right? I don't mean that. This could be boiled down into conversations between parents and children about two questions: what and why, right? What do you believe? What do I believe? Why do we believe it? Or why do I believe it? Why do you believe it? That's it. So, I've had really, like, a friend of mine's an electrician. We have good philosophical conversations. Another guy, I can't remember what he does, but he calls himself a garage philosopher, right? Kind of like Garage Band, I guess. But I'm not, well, maybe I am, but my intent here is not to be elitist in any sense. I'm not saying, right, parents need to take a philosophy class or have a college degree or all that kind of stuff. That's not the point. But I'm saying that a philosophical education simply is one that, well, I'll just talk about it, all right? So it takes its inspiration from Socrates, right? And let me say this again, though. This is important. Again, I think the ought implies can principle applies here. So there are a lot of preconditions, I guess I would say, that need to be met before a parent might be able to do this, right? So if I'm a single parent and I'm working, 2 jobs, I mean, it's probably not the number one thing on my radar is just like talk about Socrates' view of the good life, right? Or any kind of those kind of questions, right? We're just trying to make it through the day. But I think that if we can, but it can still happen, right? You still have a relationship, no matter all the other stresses come in. But there are places in the world where people are living at a subsistence level, where they're surrounded by war, by terrible things, right? So just bracketing all that stuff, right? If parents can do this, then I think they should to some degree, okay? All right, so anyway, what is it? Well, it takes Socrates and John Stuart Mill as its primary inspirations. I mean, you could find this in other philosophers, but if we look at sort of the Socrates part of this philosophical education, it's simply, well, it doesn't have to be, it's formal. It all could be informal, right? So formal, it doesn't really matter, right? It could be public, private, religious, homeschool, that doesn't matter. And it's the function of the education. It's asking some of these big questions and trying just to talk through them together and maybe make some progress in answering them. I think in terms of the parent-child relationship, I'm focused more on the informal things that can happen in everyday family life, right? Conversations around the dinner table or in the car or on the train or whatever it is, right? Those times where you actually get a chance to talk with your kids, okay? So for Socrates, it's just that. It's encouraging and developing the abilities that allow somebody to think through the big questions in life about human nature, good, evil, God, the good life, the common good, right? All those sorts of things that people have thought about for thousands of years. It involves thinking about what's good and true and beautiful, and then trying to figure out how to live out your answers in your daily life to those questions. So it emphasizes reasoning skills, and then applying those skills to questions about the good life, but then taking that further step of actually trying to live it out, right? And so philosophy, at least in this tradition, is not just about it's not just about logical puzzles or interesting questions or really abstract arguments. It's about connecting those things to our daily lives. The second part comes from John Stuart Mill, a British philosopher from the 1800s, and this has to do more with focusing on the value of ongoing discussion and debate. Right? Now, Mill points out it's rare that anybody has the full truth. I think he's right about that, and that even mistaken views about something can contain portions of the truth. Right? Debating issues can supply the remainder of it. And so discussion and debate that's open in that context can uncover truths. That kind of debate can also help us see why we believe what we do, according to Mill, whether those reasons are good or not. If we've never really talked about or examined, right, the foundations of our beliefs about these big questions, then we don't know if we have beliefs that are based on prejudice or just sort of groundless opinion rather than, good evidence. And so in this tradition, we should equip children through this kind of education to be able to understand and defend their beliefs against the most common objections. All that keeps the truth alive, right? Keeps it from becoming a dead dogma. And in fact, I think most crucially for parents, this kind of education can encourage children to let the truth shape both their character and their conduct, right? It's about making that connection. And he says, also, I think we should be hopeful that for Mill and for us, children could develop, in his words, quote, a real and heartfelt conviction from reason and personal experience. Okay? All right, so we've got about 5 more minutes. I want to wrap this part up, and then we'll have discussion. All right, so let's look at the role of a philosophical education. Right, it can obviously the role in helping children flourish, right? So we're talking about the context of parents as stewards, of trying to foster the well-being of their kids, can help them cultivate their intellectual abilities. Most of us probably think that, and maybe it is, but most of us think that intelligence is like a natural or an innate trait. Contemporary philosopher Mark Vopat notes that there's a lot of research in support of the claim that at least gifted and talented students, they owe their gifts and talents to environmental factors rather than innate abilities. So one study found that people who are successful as adults in really intellectually demanding careers, he mentions mathematics and neurology, that there was little, if any, connection with those kids being identified at a young age as gifted or talented. Their accomplishments were the example, or the result, of environmental support, good teaching, and encouragement. And that can come from the family, can come from school, from coaches, a lot of different ways. So parents have a reason, both in formal and informal settings, to try to help their kids develop their cognitive abilities. A key one, an intellectual virtue that the philosophical education can help a kid develop, is open-mindedness. Psychologists Christopher Peterson and Martin Seligman, they describe open-mindedness this way, and I like this definition. It includes good thinking, arriving at conclusions thoughtfully, weighing the evidence for or against a belief. It's also, I think this is crucial, a significant component of empathy, and empathy is actually a fundamental trait that a lot of other virtues depend on. So when a person is open-minded, they avoid things like intolerance, prejudice, inflexibility, authoritarianism. They tend to have good traits like social intelligence, prudence, and even leadership skills. So parents have a good reason to try to cultivate this trait in their conversations. For us, our kids were in public school, and it had more to do with just talking about stuff they were learning at school. And of course, not all the time. I'm sure I could have done it more. Didn't want to annoy them more than I already did. They talked about my professor voice, which I'm assuming you're hearing right now, when I'd start pontificating about something. But yeah, it can, just having those discussions, whether it's in the car at the dinner table or just with somebody in some setting, can actually help us cultivate this trait. And this trait, this intellectual virtue, is good for us. Lastly, a philosophical education helps children cultivate resilience. And one definition of resilience is a relatively stable personality trait characterized by the ability to overcome, steer through, and bounce back from adversity. One predictor, just one, but one predictor of resilience is good parenting. Simply loving one's child, being a good steward in the ways that we've talked about a little bit. Positive bonds between a parent and child make a big difference, right? So that positive relationship, that emotional attachment between parent and child can, cover over many parental mistakes, fortunately. Other factors in resilience building include intellectual skills, self-control, and even the possession of a sense of like faith or hope or meaning in life, right? So another psychologist, Ann Maston, talks about this, that cultural traditions can support resilience. She includes religious traditions because they provide meaning and they can help people to deal with adversity. Right? She thinks religious traditions have much to offer in terms of attachment relationships, both spiritual and human, rituals of comfort and self-regulation like services for major life events, weddings, funerals, that kind of stuff, prayer, meditation, many other kinds of assistance. And so parents who do follow some sort of religious tradition would do well to make use of those resources. Those who don't should look to other cultural traditions that can maybe help foster resilience in their kids, okay? And a philosophical education can do this, right? And it doesn't have, well, so here's an example. Consider, so I see this in my own, on my campus, like we're in the South, so there's, just the very top of the Bible Belt. But I teach philosophy, and so a lot of students will come in, some with a religious background, some not, but a lot of the religious students struggle, like in a philosophy class, when we start talking about the problem of evil, right? Which is, in a sense, that how could a perfect being, right, the all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful God, allow the evil and suffering that exists in the world? And so think about a child from maybe a devout religious background, or not a child anymore, a college student, right? That might cause them to start questioning their belief, right? And some people, they find that problem of evil sufficient for rejecting their faith. Other people are satisfied with the answers that philosophers and theologians have given to the problem of evil. But my point here is not really so much where the person comes out on the religious question, but rather that very process, which is part of a philosophical education, a philosophical approach to life's big questions, can foster resilience, right? So think about when some of your own important beliefs, past or present, have been challenged, right? Initially, we just don't want to think, or at least for me, I don't want to think about it, but then I think, well, I need to think about it. And so if it's a foundational belief, religious or moral or something like that, or political even, that can be difficult. That's adversity, right? It's emotionally difficult. You want an answer you don't know. You think this thing that you've maybe centered your life on might be misguided. But dealing with it honestly and going through the process of just trying to figure out what the evidence is and where it leads, that can build resilience. Now, of course, we want to be careful, right? Because as parents, an exclusive or excessive focus on resilience is not good. Right? It doesn't justify a lack of kindness or compassion to a child, so it doesn't mean you can berate your kid on the soccer field or yell at him for being soft if his feelings are hurt at school, or justify sort of being emotionally distanced because, that will toughen your daughter up for real life in the real world. But resilience is important, right? And so trying to figure out that balance, right? Who knows? That's why parenthood requires practical wisdom. That's why it's one of the most demanding and difficult roles if we try to do it well. All right, in conclusion, parents have one more reason for exposing their kids through this, what I'm calling a philosophical education, to other religious, moral, and political views that are different from their own. Parents are fallible, right? Your parents could be wrong. My parents could be wrong, right? We know that. We wish they knew it. But look, a child might end up with a different belief or belief system than their parents, and the child could be right. That could be the case, right? Obviously. Providing a philosophical education to children allows for that possibility, but it also communicates a trust in the child as they develop that she's able to explore and answer those kind of questions for herself, right? Parents just need to allow and be prepared for the possibility that a child's going to depart from their moral, political, and or religious values. But whether or not this occurs, trying to loop it back around now, parents need to realize the importance of respecting her autonomy, and they need to continue to hope for and support her in her pursuit of a flourishing life. At its best, parental commitment to a child is unconditional. It's not dependent, upon her holding to values and a view of the good life that are the same as her parents. Love, the fundamental and universal value at the heart of the parent-child relationship, demands nothing less. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Austin. And now our panelists, Dr. Jessica Flanagan and fellow CRC Honors Scholar Nadia Noah Connolly, will offer some comments.
Hello? Sorry about that. Well, first of all, thank you for the talk. I thought it was very interesting, and I appreciate the defense of the philosophical education of somebody who really enjoys philosophy. And something I was thinking about as you were talking was how the values of the parents intersect with like societally approved values, like in the time that they are, trying to influence their kids towards those values. Like, so if, in the 50s, trying to influence a daughter towards, being a housewife, that would be very much what was societally thought to be the correct thing. But now that would have a very different effect on the child. And so just with like this framework of, like the parent can take the same actions and have the same discussions with their child, but depending on like what the general like societal setting of this, it's going to have a vastly different influence. So I guess the first question is, do you think that like while talking to their children about these issues, they should take in like the societal influence that it's also going to have on them, like how much society conforms to their own values or how much it doesn't conform, and like how strongly that should encourage them to influence their children towards a certain value. And second of all, the question that came up for me is I think that something that happens often with trying to influence kids towards value is personal conflicts between parents and children. So you can see, you'll see parents who want their kids to influence their kids towards one thing, but not because of the actual value itself, but because of a particular relationship between the way the parent tries to influence that child toward that value, that they will actually go away from it, not based on reason or morals or anything like that, but just because of the particular, like personality interactions that occur between parent and child.
So just to clear, the second one is if the parent, the child will leave the value. Okay, I got you. Yeah. So let's start with that one. I think, that's look. Values are difficult. That's why we're still arguing about stuff that people wrote 2,000 or more years ago. And so, I guess for me, that's why, and I don't really mention it till the very end, and that's on purpose because I'm trying to look at other issues, but it's got to happen in the context of this. Look, I'm idealistic about this stuff, and you can ask my kids. I'm far from perfect, but this environment of love, right? That there shouldn't be parents who disown their kids because of fill in the blank. To me, it's just terrible, all right? And I'm not saying it's no matter how difficult, when you become a parent, you sign up for, right? The job doesn't stop. So I would say, that as parents, if the child leaves a value because of that sort of interpersonal conflict, right? That conflict's got to be dealt with, right? Parents might need to ask for forgiveness. There's got to be some kind of some kind of reconciliation between the two, and that's where the allowing let the kid to live how they want to live, right? Easier said than done, obviously, for a lot of us. But I think your point about society's values and conflict is really important because this is where we get a lot of social problems. So parents don't like what the public school values are, or there's conflict, right, between like the values the family thinks are important and the broader cultural ones, right? It was silly, but we used, look, at least in our family, one is sort of this consumerism of our society, and I like all the shiny stuff we can get, and I've got, more of it than I need. But that's something we tried to talk about with our kids. Like we would, even when they were little, we would make fun of commercials that if you have this thing, your life is going to be perfect and happy, and you'll be beautiful, and everyone will love you. You can really call those things into question. So I guess you've got to, if your beliefs and values in some places, which hopefully they do, really go against the prevailing cultural norms, right? That's worth talking about too. Why, where do these norms come from, right? I wouldn't talk about it with that language, maybe with a little kid, but why do people think this? Why is it that this view of the good life is put forth so much in the United States through media and other means? And is it right? Is it wrong? Why is it good? Why is it bad? Those kind of questions. So, but yeah, if you're going to have especially if it's a more radically different moral view, part of parenting them would be you're going to feel pushback about this at school or at work or whatever it is. But yeah, good questions. Thank you.
So, is this on? Good. Okay. So thank you so much. That was super interesting. I'm a parent too, so I was taking lots of notes. And you tried to bait me in by talking about the new Kanye album, which I'm not going to devote all of my comments to. But if anybody else would like to talk about the philosophy of that album afterwards, I'm here for you because I have a lot of feelings. But I'll focus on the rest of the talk, which is two questions. The first is that there's a sort of tension, I think, between this idea of fostering open-mindedness as a civic and intellectual virtue going either really far towards the open-mindedness pole. So on one pole, you might think, why not, if this is like a virtue for us to cultivate in our kids, why not engage in active counter-programming? So this is like kind of following up on your 50s patriarchy example. Like, we should be engaging in active counter-programming against dominant cultural values for our children to foster this. So like, for example, my kids are in public school. It makes them say the Pledge of Allegiance all the time. And I'm like, counter-programming against that. I'm like, that's so messed up that you're like 5 years old and you have to pledge your allegiance to a nation. Like, that's anyhow. So like, why not like really go far into the counter-programming? On the other, that seems in tension with the idea of instilling values as a starting point. But then if you think like, no, you want to give them something to hold on to. You want to instill some values as a starting point for the development of their autonomous capacities. Why not go really far in the other direction? On the other hand, like, why not just teach them the truth? Why not be more steadfast? After all, if you really think that something is the truth, why not go for it? And you kind of say like, well, you should have some humility. You should sort of like hedge against it in this way. But then I think about like some values where I really am just going to tell my kids like, nope, this is the truth. And it's because like there are certain ideas that are going to be destructive or dangerous. And so I might say, maybe my daughter was exposed to a value which is like, women can't be political leaders because like, look at what happened recently, and then I'd be like, oh no, like that's not the truth. Like, and I should just like shut it down. And so at the point that I have limits and I'm going to like start instilling the truth in them, why not just like tell them all of the truth that I believe? Like, why not just remain steadfast in my conviction? And maybe you think like, well, there's moral progress, and so you should think of like the children of the future. We should have a hedge against our own fallibility or something. But it also seems, looking at history, that we've made moral progress one generation at a time with parents remaining steadfast. And so how do you kind of like steer between these two potential poles of like active counter-programming to foster maximal open-mindedness or strong steadfastness? And then my second question is, sometimes there's unequal distribution of access to a values-based education or a philosophical education. And so some philosophers have argued that unequal access to like quality education is undermining justice, and that we should actually consider leveling down the most privileged students or the most privileged kids, even if it puts limits on parental choice. So for example, some philosophers have said we should ban private and religious schools. All children should have to go to public schools. And yes, that does limit parental autonomy. And it might be bad for some students who are especially privileged, but it's worth it for the sake of educational equality. Similarly, you might think with your view that what this view does is if you like tell people about these parental virtues, it's just going to exacerbate existing inequalities between people. So what's good for your kid might be bad for the many.
Yeah, by select people having access to that kind of education.
Right.
Yeah. No, that's good. So I think as far as like the first question, right, about counter programming being steadfast, probably in the back of my mind, I would, like, at least in practice, and I think in theory, even if it didn't come out, as I agree, there's some things that I would just, this is true, right? I might believe it 100% with my kids, things that we would tell them about morals or politics or, well, sports, but I was joking then, right? But yeah, I think that that's part of the starting point. I guess what I would say is some of those things for me are non-negotiable, right? About just respect for human persons and dignity and stuff. And there's just, issues of justice, like you just brought up in the second question. And so our kids, they have different views than us in some ways, but there's this thread of common belief. And I'm sure it's because, well, in part because of us, in part because of, other people that contributed to their upbringing as well. So I think there's room for that. My view is, look, I'm a moral realist. I think there are some moral truths, like capital T truths there, and there's sort of these limits within. I would still say, yeah, it's up to you. You have to decide what you believe, but here's what we believe and why. And actually, these things we believe really strongly. These things not so much, right? And so that kind of thing.
So you should apportion your parental education to your credences.
That's a good. Well, I don't know how else I would do it. I'll just for now say yes, and then we'll see where that goes. Maybe I shouldn't have said yes. We'll see where that goes.
The anti-realist or sabotage.
Yeah, exactly. As far as the access thing, that's just brutal, right? Because that's as I was looking over this last night and just thinking, this just sounds like what you would hear, an early 21st century philosophy professor, philosophers, they don't get paid a lot, compared to, a law professor, but we're doing all right. And so that's why I think, look, we have serious problems in terms of justice and access to education, opportunity, or the opportunity to get opportunities, and so those things need to be dealt with. Parental autonomy is not an absolute value, right? So when someone says, I would do anything for my kids, and I don't think, do they literally mean it? Like, would you harm, make a bunch of other people suffer? Probably we don't literally mean anything, right? Like, would you kill for your kids? Maybe to defend their lives, sure, but yeah, I'm rambling, but here's the point. I think justice is an important constraint on parental autonomy, both in the parent-child relationship and how we relate to our children, and then in general as we try to further their chances for flourishing in society, right? So we've got to have a more just distribution, and I'm happy to take some resources off the top, and I guess in some ways I'm sort of a Rawlsian about this. We've got to get where the floor is in society socioeconomically, and with education, it's below the minimum standard, right? It's got to be higher. And then once everyone's there, I'm willing to allow for more differences, but not the drastic ones.
But potentially that would put a limit on the promotion of your view, because you could use such a justification to ban religious schooling.
Yeah.
I'm afraid of the things.
Yeah. I guess I would rather, instead of banning things, I would rather provide more resources to things. But that's, it is a zero-sum game. So
yeah, there's positional goods.
Yeah. No, they're hard questions and good ones.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So we're going to move forward and take some comments from the audience. Dr. Schubert will moderate. Dr. Schubert?
For those of you just joining us for this session, we'll have two mics running. One in the hands, or mostly in the hands of Professor Swan, and one mostly in the hands of Professor Frazee. If you have a mic, you are either on or you are next in queue. If you'd like to be handed a mic, please give us a wave. And it's very helpful if you're the next person in the queue to wave before you start talking so the speakers know to whom they are directing their attention.
My question is, hearing your talk, all I hear about is good parents and integrity and good stewards. And I think also some utopian view is embedded in this of good communities. And I wonder, what do bad parents or just regular parents, do they have like, how does this talk apply to these people?
Yeah, well, I can. Yeah, you're right. Utopian or idealistic. So maybe it's a look. I guess my overall like ethical approach is like a virtue ethic one. So I'm kind of a perfectionist in the sense that I think there are these values, these ideals that we probably can't reach. None of us have, but they're worth moving toward. So regular parents, which most of us are, it's like something to aim for. Not bad parents probably have. I mean, depends on how bad, right? Really bad, they should forfeit their parental rights should be forfeit. Um, so, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, you bet.
So what's interesting about that is the bad parents. They should. It sounds like probably also have the same right to instill values in their children because they're going to those children will enter these communities that aren't so perfect. And I have an example in mind. There's some friends that I know that they actually have raised their kids to be poachers because it's a very poor family in a poor community. Other like community services haven't come in to intervene, and really, it's the entire community that has, it's a very regular community, by the way, but it's kind of a failure on everybody's part. But at the end of the day, those parents are doing what's best for their kids. The kids they're healthy, they're safe. Some of them have become adults now. And so I guess my question is really where have they gone wrong? Or why we should not promote them being parents to their children when the community has not stood up for them.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And I think that's part of I mentioned it briefly at the beginning that they're still good parents in important senses, right? I mean, so I'm putting forth ideals. Someone who doesn't do some of these things or a bunch of these things might still be like a good parent or good enough, right? But yeah, can't be done in isolation. It can't, if we're talking about the ideals and moving closer to them, there's no way it can be done as like the little sort of atomic or nuclear or whatever you want to call it family, right? The social things make it more or less likely and may even make it not a live option, right? And then we have to have a larger conversation about those kind of issues. Why do they have to, you know, why does that community have to poach to survive or to get food? What's the reasons for that? How could we address the systemic problems there? So no, there's important, right? And I guess, yeah, just to emphasize it, it's an ideal, and it assumes a lot of good things are happening in society to make it possible, which is true for some people in our society, right, in the U.S., not true for many of them, right? They don't even have the ability to do these kind of things because of those kind of systemic issues. So yeah, that's an important point to bring up and emphasize. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It sounds like you're very optimistic about philosophical education, and I'm the same, considering I'm a philosopher as well. And you also seem to suggest that philosophical education is valuable not just because it involves philosophical reflection, but also because it shapes our conduct. There's moral cultivation that takes place as we act upon the conclusions of our reasoning. So one question that I had for you is, how does philosophical education achieve this practical part in terms of moral cultivation? And then secondly, are there other kinds of disciplines or methodologies that may achieve the same thing? Like, for instance, legal reflection or critical thinking in other disciplines?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Yeah, I meant philosophical like in the broadest sense. So all disciplines, those things have sort of philosophical assumptions or elements that run through it, right? And so yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like we can, whether it's psychology or sociology or history or biology, chemistry, all those things can be involved in that kind of education. And the first part about connecting it to conduct, right? I don't think we do a good, at least in sort of 20th and 21st century, analytic philosophy. mean, I got interested in philosophy because I thought, well, look, here's this guy named Socrates trying to figure out like what's good and how to live an examined, good, fulfilling, virtuous life. I want to learn about that stuff, right? And then you like get into undergrad or grad school, and in some places it's nothing more than, well, let's just like talk. It's professionalized in the sense of let's have a research program and let's solve like some really interesting logical problems. Like let's talk write for years about whether chairs exist or not. And I like metaphysics, right? So that I'm not denigrating that in a certain degree, but at the end of the day, philosophical reflection, whether it's that abstract metaphysically or in other realms, right? It's a fair question. I have my students ask, what's this have to do with my life? And maybe it doesn't have anything to do with it. I tell them anything we talk about, I can connect to their lives, and so far, maybe sometimes the connection's a little strained, but I make it. The other thing, like, I actually stole this idea from Professor Di Silvestro, right? I don't know if he still does it, but character experiment. So I have my students in my ethics class, if they can either write a paper, a traditional philosophy paper, or they can do this experiment where they pick a few virtues just to experiment and try to cultivate and reflect on. So those kind of questions like, I want to live a good life, what keeps me from doing it? Philosophical thought and reflection can help. And actually learning some psychology can be really helpful, right? You can learn about what can help us grow in self-control and what doesn't. There's actual empirical data to bring in. So those are the kind of thoughts that come to mind for me.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I find your core thesis pretty compelling, almost to a certain extent impossible to argue with on its own merits, but I do want to, in the spirit of good philosophical pressure, push you a little bit. So I'm wondering if perhaps you're overestimating both the value and the capacity of autonomy as such. I'm trying to imagine situations where the parent might be in a situation to do something greater by subverting their own child's autonomy. So I'll give both a secular and a religious example. On the secular side, fully autonomous humans will often gravitate towards false, harmful, or even bigoted views. It's not hard to imagine, for example, a young child starting to go onto the internet and get sucked into like white supremacy or something like that. And straightforward sort of rational autonomous countering simply isn't effective. And the parent might have at their disposal ways of subverting their child's autonomy in a way that would steer them away from this incredibly odious set of values and ultimately pay off in some sort of long-run capacity of helping them flourish better and be a better person. But in order to do that, they have to, in the short run, undermine their own capacity to for open-mindedness and to judge for themselves. So that's the secular example. And then on the religious side of things, many religions, have a view that if you don't have, the one true faith, that you will burn in hell for eternity. So from the inside of such a religion, it might be perfectly rational, respectable, and compatible with the love that you have for your child to precisely cut off their capacity to consider other religions, because if they fall away from the faith, then their immortal soul is going to burn for eternity. And while such a parent can value autonomy, it's not going to compare against the thought of their child being tortured for eternity.
Freely, right? Yeah.
In a limited capacity, they can cultivate autonomy and so forth, but when it comes to their religion, assuming they can successfully do this, if they can just brainwash program their child so they never fall away from the faith, wouldn't that be the loving and defensible thing to do from the inside of such a worldview?
Yeah, so with the secular example, I guess this applies to both. It applies to this first, for me, the first one more than the second, that autonomy, it's not this supreme value, right? So I think, just in human life, we don't get to do what we want all the time, right? And that's okay. It's part of community and things like that. But I would, look, if that was my child, I'd want to have like rational argument and persuasion, but I'd also be like, do what I could to shut it down, right? And just like, this is wrong, here's why, and no, I'll take your computer, try to do things that do subvert their autonomy. And I would sleep much better at night doing that than just, you believe what you want. Here's some reasons not to do that. So I think that's important. Right? There are some non-negotiables. Of course, the difficult thing is, for some parents, that's a non-negotiable, and then the religious example is a non-negotiable, right? So they're going to not respect their child's autonomy. And I guess this just has to, I mean, look, I have sort of some Christian theistic commitments, and but I guess I just can only speak from my view of the nature of faith. I don't see faith as the product of like that example, like brainwashing or never exposing them to anything else. Well, I mean, the exposure is a separate question. The brainwashing is just like, it doesn't seem to be, you know, how to put it, right? Faith's got to be, in some sense, authentic, and actually the person's, in some sense, they've actually believe it and committed to it. And so, if the only reason a child is going through these religious practices and says they believes these, yeah, it's a hard question. What, you know, do they really believe those things or not? If they've been brainwashed, in a sense, yes. But then, in a sense, the genealogy of the belief kind of undermines the authenticity of it, for me anyway. But yeah, you're right. From within the worldview, autonomy, who cares, right? I don't want my kid to burn in hell for eternity. And I guess I would say to a parent like that, well, I don't know if I'd say that. I guess I would just try to say, it depends on the religion, but if you can, like, what's the nature of faith? And is that the kind of faith that saves? Or, you know, depending on the religious faith. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts. But yeah, it's important because I think in ethics today, many philosophers put too much weight on autonomy, which is why I feel this tension that the heart of my talk was about autonomy. But I think it is an important element of a good life. So, but it's not the trump card for everything.
Hi, thanks. I'm just trying to get clear about the exact claim under consideration here. And it's because I have this example in mind, and I'm hoping to find out what you think about it. So, I'm just a racist. I value taking this sort of negative attitude toward a certain population. And furthermore, I don't value autonomy. I don't value a good philosophical education. And then I think what we have is the intuition that I probably don't have an obligation to instill those values in my children. But furthermore, I have an obligation not to. And so I wonder what the claim under consideration is. Is it that anyone who can seek to influence the values of their children should? That seems false. If it's that anyone who can seek to influence the values of their children should in these ways, namely through autonomy, by instilling autonomy and a good philosophical education, that seems false too, precisely because I can't, if I'm this person in my example, I can't instill or seek to influence racist values by those means. So I'm just wondering what you think.
No, that's good. Because I haven't really filled out like more detail than autonomy, and I waved my hand at a few things, but I would say I would say the racist parent who doesn't value autonomy is actually obligated to instill different they're obligated, morally speaking, they ought to change their values and then seek to influence their kids towards those. So I would say that, yeah, I guess a basic ethic of respect for other human persons, which of course, racism violates that off the bat. I would include certain, whether you want to call them virtues or values, things like certain forms of justice. And these are hard questions. We've got to talk and argue about what they actually involve. But justice, compassion, courage, love, sort of these, while there's so much disagreement, for sure, morally speaking, you look at a lot of different moral and wisdom traditions, there is, in many ways, there's common ground that can be found, and I think we've got to start there. I think it starts with respect for persons and what that entails. So I would say parents are obligated to teach their children and try to influence their children to have that basic respect for the value of other human beings, and some of the virtues and values that fall out of that. And so a parent who doesn't do that, so I don't want someone to say, those aren't my values, so I'm not obligated. Like, well, no, then your values need to change, right? And I'm not saying I don't know what the role of the state is in that. That's a harder question. But just purely morally speaking, that's what I would say.
Hello.
Hi.
So I was questioning Irvine's, ideologies about how a parent should raise their child and what rights a child has. And it seemed like they wanted to promote like the child's open-mindedness and to rather raise them on the morality of like reason instead of on faith. And I was wondering if is it truly to the child's benefit to leave them open, like at that point their mind isn't fully developed and they don't have rational thinking the way adults do. Is it to that child's benefit to raise them that way rather to raise them within like a certain set of beliefs or a faith and to have them included within their family and their community rather than being feel left out or to not be within, I guess, the community that their parents are in, and they're just sitting here in confusion for years and years without the actual developed mind for rational thinking? And isn't it better to just raise them within the faith that their parents had and then let them and depend on their own independent capacity to think for themselves when they're old enough and to decide whether they truly believe what faith they were raised in or whether they want to switch to something else or whatever other idea they want to think of? Like, isn't it better that way rather than to leave them in confusion for all those years and trying to figure out what do I do now?
Yeah, no, I think that's, look, I agree with you. And so I think that's part of why he's mistaken, and part of what I tried to argue is just that kind of thing. And so it's, for someone who's, I mean, I don't know him, but I'm assuming he doesn't. I mean, I don't know. Let's assume that he's agnostic or secular or something, and so religion's not a big part of his life. But for a family that it is, right, that can be something that can be like important part of what just holds, shared culture and the shared beliefs, the practices, part of like just the daily part of family life, right? So to just, well, you can join in when you're older and decide whether, I think you're right, I guess is what I'm saying in short. And so part of it is this is if parents are religious, this is what we believe. We're going to include our kids with it. They've got probably good reasons within their religious faith to do so. But then I think the point I'm trying to argue is what you said at the end, that there is going to come a day where the child's going to either make that faith their own or not. And that's a crucial part where parents, I would say, that unconditional love and acceptance has to be there, right? You're still a part of our family, even if you don't share this part of us. It doesn't matter. You're my daughter or my son or my brother. So I think you're right. I think you have to have a starting point, right? You can't just, now let's say parents are secular, they don't have that. There probably would be other things, non-religious things that tie the family together, and then that's what they're sharing with them, and that's sort of what they start with, and then maybe the child leaves some of those things or not later. But yeah, I think that's really important because it sounds good when you're just writing about stuff in your office, like, well, just let children decide, but in the real world, it doesn't, there's a problem there. So, yeah, good point.
Please join me in thanking our speaker, our panelists, and our session chair.